First, I just want to clarify that the scope then of this panel is going to be to focus on the goals and challenges that we face in getting to the objective of cross-media measurement. And so to simplify this, we're actually going to talk about cross-media measurement for video as it's moving across platforms. We can do short-form, long-form video, but let's stick to video. So let's just start by having, George has been introduced, but let's start by having the rest of the panelists introduce themselves, your roles in your respective companies, and then we'll get to the issues at hand.
Sure, Jane. Hi, my name is Josh Chasin, and I am Chief Research Officer at comScore.
I'm Howard Shimmel. I'm Chief Research Officer at Turner, responsible for all Turner U.S. domestic research.
Adam Gerber, Head of North American Investment for Essence, which is part of Group M.
I'm Bill Key. I lead product management for ads measurement at Google, touching on a lot of areas around viewability and reach measurement and attribution as well.
And I'm Daniel Slotweiner, Director of Advertising Research at Facebook.
I don't know, this happened last week that the Google and the Facebook guys were at one end of the panel here. I don't know.
I'm surprised they're sitting next to each other.
Anyway, so we're going to start with the needs and the goals of the buyers. So we're going to start right in the middle with Adam here. As you're working to meet the needs of your clients, how do you see this whole cross-media, ad, video measurement challenges?
I'm going to use 3 words that are going to make this sound a lot simpler than it really is, as George can probably attest to, given the decades of work that he's been focused on this. But the first thing, look, at the end of the day, from the buy side, what we need is a way to understand where habits are changing. And the consumption of media, while still growing, is happening in all sorts of different ways. And so the first critical thing is I need consistency. I need to be able to look at data that represents different suppliers in the marketplace or different types of inventory in a way that allows me to make an apples-to-apples comparison. The second thing I need is transparency. I need to understand what the data is that I'm looking at, how it was generated, and what it represents. Because as more and more consumption fragments and as more of the measurement relies on publisher-side implementations, there's less ability to police what's being rolled up into the ratings. So I need to have transparency to understand how things are being aggregated and surfaced to the marketplace. And then lastly, what I really need and what I think is going to be the biggest challenge, it was the last thing that George alluded to, is I need to be able to see the entire marketplace. The beauty of the TV landscape is that we've had, whether you like them or not, we've had a measurement service, and we now have a couple measurement services, that have the ability to see virtually the entire landscape of linear TV, because they do it through panels. They don't rely on the television networks to report data to them or to allow them to watch what's running through their signals. They have panels. They see what's happening through third-party meters. And they basically can report a rating for any network that has enough of a sample to project against. And that makes it fairly easy for the buy side to understand the marketplace, to size the market, to make trending estimates, to forecast for the upfront, and it helps the sellers too, sure, because it helps the sellers understand their competitive positioning. So if I don't have a full view of the marketplace, everything breaks down in terms of being able to evaluate the marketplace and value the different participants. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully that gives you. Oh, and by the way, I think one of the things you surfaced in the phone call was where do I think we have gaps? Everywhere. Across all 3. Nothing is happening properly now. So that's the problem.
Okay, great. We're going to get to all of those. Let's start first with Josh at comScore. So major provider of measurement services here. How are you developing products to meet these challenges, and kind of how far away are we from the solutions?
Yeah, so one of the things, the fundamental characteristics of measurement products is that they exist as part of an ecosystem where business is conducted in a certain way. So in the TV marketplace, and you talked about video, so let's think about it. Cross-platform video, in a sense, you can see it as either TV and digital coming together or an evolution of TV, but ultimately, there are existing marketplaces. So these marketplaces have constructs. You've got the upfronts, you've got scatter markets, you've got forecasting of ratings, you've got post-buy evaluations. The measurement services, the legacy measurement services that serve this ecosystem are, really, they've been developed in the 60s, and they haven't changed a whole lot since then. And Adam talked about panel-based measurement. So if you look at, comScore essentially at this point has two predecessor companies. comScore is one of them, and RenTrack is the other. And both of those companies were very much invested in bringing big data assets into the space of media measurement. On the comScore side, it was census data for digital, and on the RenTrack side, it was very large set-top box data footprint, a very, very large set-top box data footprint. We think of products in the audience measurement space really as, interfaces that users can access to manipulate data and run rankers and look at that, look at reports. And so ours have names like Mediametrics and multi-platform and extended TV and cross-media or X-media. What I think is happening, though, Jane, is that increasingly, I think you're going to see companies like ours and other measurement companies providing data outside of the interfaces, data directly, and big data assets, directly to buyers and sellers. So, for example, we have quote-unquote activation products, where we are able to characterize devices or cookies or consumers by advanced targets, and so that becomes an input into transactions. We have data that is feeding into OpenAP, which Turner and Howard are one of the pioneers behind. We are, some of the most exciting things that we're doing involves work we're doing with networks and with agencies where we provide massive sort of ongoing data feeds. These are, in a sense, they're outside of the traditional products per se, but they are a way to productize the data. We'll continue, and I think all of us will continue, with these sort of interface products that are used for Adam's total view of the market. But I think increasingly we're going to be bringing value, and when I say we, just to be clear, I mean all us research companies. I think increasingly we're going to bring value to the marketplace with big data that characterizes and describes audiences that can be fed directly into transactions, marketplaces, and DMPs.
Great. No, and I think we have been hearing this, over the last 6 months to a year or so, that it may not be one solution anymore for cross-media measurement. There's a lot of data sharing that we've been hearing about, data co-ops, new ways to look at this, because as we're also moving cross-platform, we're moving into these bigger data sets and away from panels. But let's talk a little bit about some of the, the digital players here. So on just bringing all of that in, on the YouTube platform, Bill, there's challenges for Google to meet these MRC standards and kind of participate in these third-party measurement solutions. How do you view those, and how is Google addressing those?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would say is I actually don't think there are fundamental challenges around that. And from the perspective of working with the marketplace, we're heavily invested in actually working with standards. So I think we have about 30 MRC accreditations today. And as George mentioned, there's a number of metrics that we're working after across a lot of our platforms. I will say that it's not a fundamental challenge, but there is a challenge sometimes around the technology side, just in the sense that there are a number of platforms. We have different platforms through which you can buy media and report on it, even within Google, and each one of those needs to be accredited, and we need to work through the process for each of those. But I think at a fundamental level, we're very much aligned with this and have actually seen a lot of value by working on standards that allow, ultimately, I think, for the ecosystem to become more transparent. I think similarly on the third-party side, we've actually invested quite a bit in the last few years, particularly on YouTube, around enabling cross-publisher audience reach measurement. So we have close partnerships with both Nielsen and comScore that allow data from YouTube to be used to provide cross-media measurement, and that's very important to our customers. We hear that a lot, and we're working with the MRC ultimately to drive towards accreditation of those as well. And then finally, I would say when you look across the ecosystem itself, right, a lot of the challenges do come from the technical side of it, like even implementing viewability measurement in all the different environments where it can occur can be tricky, and so we're working with an organization called the Coalition for Open Measurement to implement some standards around ultimately how viewability can be measured on different platforms, so that it becomes much easier, if there's a new ad format or a new digital property comes out, to integrate with that, so it's not a tremendous amount of additional work. So I think we're very interested in being able to push towards not only implementing the standards, but having them be accredited, and then in many cases working with third parties to enable measurement as well.
But now when that data comes into the third-party measurement providers, does it come in with like a piece of the identity data so that it can be deduplicated?
Yes,
can be connected into their identity
for reach
data?
measurement, absolutely. Yeah, so that's when we work with Nielsen and comScore, it enables deduplicated reach measurement across cross-publisher platforms.
Yeah, because that's been kind of a big hole. It's really just recently that
It's recent that we've enabled, particularly, it's been there for a while for the web, but on mobile, there were some additional steps that we need to take, but that's something we've made progress on in the last year.
Okay, and how about, Daniel, how about the same kind of question really for Facebook? You're distributing all kinds of video now, short form, long form, live streaming. The news format is very unique in the kind of challenges that you have for issues of viewability. So how does Facebook fit into all of this?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess I would start off by saying I think we should step back and think a little bit about the progress we've made, because if I'm sitting in your shoes running a video campaign across TV and digital and Facebook and YouTube and Turner, I think we're actually in a pretty good position now where you can see unduplicated reach and frequency across these platforms. You can see your on-target demographics by publisher, and so you actually have a pretty good view. And if you complement that with the viewability options available, it's possible to see kind of what duration you're getting across platforms and things. So I think a lot of this stuff is actually it's not perfect, and it's in various stages of MRC accreditation, which I think is super important. But we're on the path. I think that's actually important that we sort of recognize that. You can actually see a lot more than you could even a couple of years ago across these campaigns. And just hopefully in that answer, you get a little bit of the sense of where we stand, which is we think that it's incredibly important that transparency be there for the industry. We know that we have to play a part in providing that data into these systems, and we want to and are and will. And so I think that's kind of the most important thing from a measurement standpoint. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, from our perspective, that's really kind of that's kind of what the industry needs. And now the question is, like, how do we figure out what the right comparison metrics are? They should all be there, and the transparency should be there. And now it's a question of doing the research to understand what makes sense when you're actually deciding where to put a dollar. And that is a much harder, frankly, much harder problem, but really the right one. The question is, I think not even so much like what duration are you getting for $1 here, $1 there, but what outcome are you getting? And does it take the same amount of duration on one platform as it does on the other to get that outcome? We have no idea. I would venture to say.
Yeah, I just have to jump in.
Go ahead. Yeah, you guys, you can all jump in. I'm not gonna
no disrespect to Facebook but while I think there's been a lot of progress, I give you that. We are a long way from anyone on the buy side having tools that allow them to properly measure cross-platform unduplicated reach. I mean, I can do it in pockets of the ecosystem with measurements that don't follow consistent guidelines. But I do not have a way to accurately measure unduplicated reach in a consistent way across every publisher on every platform, OTT, browser-based, app-based, linear TV, time-shifted, DVR, it doesn't exist. And if anyone tells you it does, they're lying to you.
Are you talking about content or ads?
Talking about ads. The solution does not exist. There are solutions that allow me to measure pockets, but every publisher has not adopted Nielsen or comScore's SDKs in their apps. Okay, so there is not 100% coverage of the marketplace. There are publishers who still reject the tags. Okay, there are networks who still reject the tags and don't implement. And there's large swaths of the DVR and VOD ecosystem that aren't measurable the way that we would need them to be to produce unduplicated reach. So yes, a ton of progress has been made, but the marketplace is changing faster than any of us can keep up with. It's to no fault of anyone. The marketplace is changing too fast.
Yeah, and people still want to withhold data. Data is a method of controlling, how you run your business. So.
And just one last point. Measuring the post-campaign unduplicated reach is great, but the bigger part of my job is on the front end, making the right allocation. And those tools are in a much worse position for cross-platform measurement, understanding and predicting audience than the post-campaign. I give you the post-campaign measurement is a lot further along than the forecasting and planning side. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah, let's just bring the TV side in here, Howard. So yeah, I see you're about to jump right in. But make sure you also address the issue of, one thing that doesn't really get enough attention when George talks about all these standards is that TV right now, we don't measure TV ads, We measure this thing called C3, which is where you average all the minutes that have at least 50% of the minute is made up of ads. You average those across the entire program. And so we're not actually measuring specific ads. So to get to this comparable kind of measure that George is talking about, this could be a huge change for the TV industry. So give us some perspective on all of this from the TV industry, Howard.
Yeah, now, look, I'll talk from a cross-platform perspective just because I don't think there is a TV industry anymore, TV-centric companies anymore. One thing that Adam said that's really important, and I think we all have to get our heads around that the world we live in is no longer focused just on the spot in Animal Kingdom on TNT. We have to change our focus to we're trying to build campaigns across platform. We're trying to steward and optimize those campaigns using all of the capabilities of linear TV and addressable and VOD. And then on the back end, we need to then measure it. And we need research infrastructure that actually supports each of those stages. And I don't know necessarily that we're ready to acknowledge that. We would love to do things in the upfront that we guarantee reach and frequency of CNN cross-platform, not just GRP impressions on CNN, linear TV, and then do digital separately. And having the data to actually enable that in the right way is something we're all missing. Look, the idea about exact commercial ratings on TV is a really big ordinary one. If that's where the industry goes, obviously we'll support it. I think, we have to think about that metric. Is that a selling metric? Is that a guarantee metric? Is that an outcome measurement metric? Because I can control how many people come into a break, but then I can't control what they do in the break based on what the creative is. So I think there's just a lot we need to really think about before we dive. We should be spending a lot of time thinking about that and studying that.
Yeah, great. So George, your research list of all the things you have to do here. Talk a little bit about the whole issue of duration weighting and how controversial or how this is going to work, and anyone can jump right in. But this is, is everyone kind of saying, yes, I agree, this is the way to go, we can do this? Or are you getting pushback? I mean, how is it going?
I wish anything we introduced, everybody would say, yes, I agree. We don't get that. Duration weighting, so first of all, we haven't codified a requirement for duration weighting anywhere yet. We issued a digital audience measurement standard, and in that standard, what we told the industry was, hey, when we write the cross-media standard, which is going to be coming in sort of third quarter of 2018, what we want to prepare you for is we're thinking about implementing duration-weighted GRPs. So industry, we'd like to begin collecting feedback on that. Several things have been said that ring true. Number one, if we don't get adoption of the ability to measure ad-based duration-weighted GRPs in all media silos, this doesn't work. So if the TV industry says, no, we'd rather have, average minute commercial ratings, this doesn't work. Because if you just do it in digital, what it does is it disadvantages a media type. So we have to be very fair. But the concept of duration weighting is just to duration of the video. So I used an example when I was speaking. I watched 5 seconds of a 15, you watched 10, and you watched the whole one. Well, my 5 seconds of the 15, is that a third of the value of the exposure? Or did more of the value inure in the first 5 seconds? Is value built completely on a straight line basis, 5 to 15, 5 to 10 to 15? The answer to that is likely no, and the answer to that is creative dependent and media vehicle dependent. If I'm in a news feed or if I'm, applying my ad to UGC video content in YouTube, whatever that is, that's going to be different. So there's a controversy there, but that's why we told the industry we'd like to study this for a year. MRC is going to be putting out a data spec on this. We hope all the companies here and agencies will participate in helping us gather data to set a standard that helps recognize how complex video is across the ecosystem and try to equalize it so we can get to what Adam wants eventually, looking. If I have another dollar to invest as an advertiser, where should I invest that? Should I invest that in Facebook mobile? Should I invest that in Turner? Should I invest that in print? Should I invest that in radio? That's what we're trying to get to.
So if I may, I'm actually one of the people that's given Gerber some pushback on this. And for a couple of reasons. One is that I think I would feel more comfortable as someone who works with colleagues to architect cross-media products if it was a recommendation or a guideline as opposed to a standard, because what happens is when it's a standard, it becomes part of what we get audited against in an MRC audit. I'm concerned that the requirement for duration weighting for cross-platform reporting assumes facts of measurement granularity not in evidence. So in other words, it assumes that on both sides of on all sides, I was going to say both sides, but on all sides, TV, digital, but all the different kinds of digital and all the different kinds of TV, that we can measure at a sufficiently granular time level that we are introducing quality and parity into the measurement and not introducing a false sense of that, right? So in other words, if we know that we can measure in all the places an ad becomes manifest exactly how long each consumer saw that ad, out of how many seconds that it is, then I feel much better about this. But we just heard that right now TV is measured in average minute, average commercial, C3 minutes. So there's a ways to go before we can be sure that all the component parts can be measured at that level of duration granularity.
So I haven't gone on record as joining Josh in my concern about this, but I'm now going to do that. So let me play devil's advocate, because I always like to think about the unintended consequences. So the first thing I'm going to do, if we ever move to that, is I'm going to find some creative folks, and I'm going to open a creative agency whose sole task is to game the system of a ratings-based model that's duration-based. I will build creative that pushes the key messaging into the first 3 seconds of the ad. I won't care if the rest of the ad gets watched, and I will benefit as an advertiser because I won't be paying for all the audience that tunes out of the ad. There are so many unintended consequences that I think jeopardize that approach. The fact that creative is not linear in terms of the value that it creates, the fact that every advertiser's creative will be different in terms of the value that it creates, the stage of the campaign, whether it's a launch or a mature campaign. There's so many variables that impact the value creation over time. I just don't see how you build that model, I mean, in all honesty, George. But I'm not the mathematician, so maybe there's a way to do it. The second thing I'd point out is pod positions matter. And in today's world, if you know TV, the A position has about a 20% drop in audience in the first 3 or 4 seconds. Is that about right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So average minute ratings give an advantage to the A position because it's not factoring in the full value of that audience that you're getting the first 3 to 5 seconds of the ad. If we go to commercial ratings, if we go to duration-based ratings, it kind of blows up the construct of how suppliers manage their inventory, how advertisers think about pod positions. I also am severely concerned about every different distribution platform, whether it's in feed or it's on YouTube in a different type of environment, whether it's in app, the viewing experience is different in each case. And think about how advertisers produce their creative today. It's unfortunately still a single ad, pretty much blown across all platforms. Well, if you're using duration weighting and every platform has a different type of engagement, and advertisers are still producing a single ad and not optimizing their versions or their creative to the distinct platforms where they're running, where they're going to get the most value, I think that's a loss for everyone. I think it makes certain publishers perform worse. I think it doesn't provide all the value for the advertiser. I'm concerned that we're trying to get too complicated with measurement and that we're going to layer in all sorts of additional costs for intermediaries to be measuring things that at the end of the day don't provide enough of an incremental value to the ecosystem.
Well, and Adam, you said something that's really important, which is I think research we could be doing over the next year, next 18 months, which is if you introduce this level of granularity to TV or digital, what does it do to the readability of that media and driving advertiser outcomes, right? And we should not introduce a measurement if we don't know we're going to get increased granularity, increased readability from. So we could right now take a marketing mix study, plug in someone, Alfonso Samba's exact commercial ratings, and look to see does the R-square on the model improve or not. And that should be part of our research should be about measuring outcomes, not just determining if there's a standard.
So we've done some of this within our platform, looking at just, comparing campaigns that have different average duration for the videos watched to outcomes, because we've measured them all the way to sales. And you can see very clearly there's not a strong relationship between duration. And that doesn't mean that on an individual basis, watching an ad for longer isn't better. It is. But when you aggregate up, you have these issues of creative quality and things like that make it pretty clear that on the whole, you would not expect to see average longer duration campaigns produce better outcomes or higher ROI.
So it's not a linear relationship between time spent and effectiveness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're actually getting kind of a little bit to the end here. So you can see that there's a lot of research to be done in the next year. You guys are going to definitely have work to do. The metrics are going to be complicated. The consistency that Adam's asking for, the comparable metrics. The unduplicated reach is still not completely there due to all these pockets. So there's still challenges there. And we all want to head more towards attribution. And I actually would like to say one thing, a little shout out for the 4As and SIM. We have a study that's just posted on both websites that compares all the attribution providers that are out there. We might have missed a few or they didn't respond, on a whole bunch of similar characteristics so that you can actually compare them across each other. So that's also trying to get to this whole issue of how do we really want to get to the full deterministic identity-linked attribution measurement across platforms. But on that note, why don't we just wrap it up with what is the most important step that you guys think the industry should take in the next year to further this development of cross-media measurement for video ads? Go ahead, you can just go down the line, Josh. Yep, what's the most important thing we need to do in the next year?
Investment in research. It's the investment part. It's the investment part that's important, yeah.
Uh-oh, spend money.
Spend money, buy stuff.
Okay, George.
Well, in the introduction of our digital standards, we put several calls to action, only one of which is duration weighting, but there's a lot of research that we hope the industry will cooperate in gathering so that we can assess it and figure out what makes sense in this area. We do think it's important to reflect in metrics or somewhere in the measurement structure progress through a video and differentiate between long and short form videos in that measurement. But we're very open-minded in terms of how that develops and the research that we would look at to inform that standard. But we think that's a pretty important step for the industry in setting the foundation for many of the things that have been talked about in this summit. More advanced looks at data, more advanced understanding of the meaning of advertising and the value of advertising. You got to have a good foundation before you do that.
Okay, Howard.
I would actually say before we do any research, we got a bunch of small people in a room, turn the air conditioning off, and make sure we all agree on the roadmap to the future. Because, I sit in a lot of Nielsen total audience meetings, and when I listen to Nielsen define that product versus the vision Adam described earlier, the vision I think we need from a selling perspective, we're driving to different states in the country. And I think we still don't, as an industry, really have a clear vision of what we want it to be with the right level of detail. So I think we should get that done first, and then we could figure out how we actually get there.
Great, Adam.
Did you say you wanted to get small people
No, I
in
think
a
he
room?
meant smart people.
Smart
I was
people.
wondering
Smart
about that
people.
too.
Why do they need to be small? I mean, look, I would love to have the nirvana of what I described earlier. I think it's a lot of work. I think it's going to take a ton of time to get there. So the question becomes, what can we do over the next year? I think what we need to do over the next year is chunk this down. So anyone who's worked at a startup knows you don't try to build it all at once. You try to build pieces and block and tackle and build it over time. So I would argue maybe what we should start thinking about is the fact that we have two very different marketplaces. And we're not going to be able to squash them together all at once and have one big measurement tool that gives us everything. Maybe we have a linear TV unit-based marketplace, and we need to figure out how to solve the problems that exist in the linear ratings world where things that are falling out of that space and not being measured correctly get measured correctly, and recognize that we have a very different impression-based marketplace with dynamic ad serving, where there's targeting going on, where there's all sorts of sophisticated real-time kind of decisioning happening, where we need to have some commonality around how Facebook and YouTube and Turner or ABC or CBS or NBC digital video that's being ad served is compared in a similar way. And maybe we don't try to do all this stuff together. So that's what I'd say.
I'll agree with part of what you said and disagree with part of what you said. So I think I actually think in terms of like the most important thing, I actually think driving towards these cross-media standards for the basics of that delivery portion of George's chart is just absolutely critical. There's just so much demand in the marketplace to be able to talk about these things in a common language that we have to make progress on that. And I agree, the duration weighting piece I think is a piece that needs more thought and time to go through, but let's not sort of lose the forest for the trees on that. I think having the basics there. And then I think what that would allow us to move into is something that gives us the prerequisites to do better outcome measurement across everything, right? So I think if we can't have the delivery metrics settled, it becomes that much harder to talk about effectiveness and outcomes, and that's ultimately what we want to drive to, right? So we see this as a two-part thing.
Great, Daniel, the last word.
Not much to add. I mean, I think if we had set, I'll continue with my theme from the beginning. If we were sitting here 5 years ago and we said, here's where we'll be in 5 years, I think a lot of us would have said the industry wouldn't move that fast and we'd be pretty satisfied, which is sad because it's slow and it's not perfect. And But on the other hand, I think we are making progress, which means that we're kind of on the right path. And so I think I agree with Howard, like we should have a couple of these steps outlined over the next year, particularly about what we're going to do research into and how that's going to feed in the decision process. But I think we're actually making progress, which is great, certainly on the top half
Okay.
of that chart.
So we'll refocus a little bit, we'll take some chunks out, and we'll try to make some more progress in the next year. And you can come back next year and hear about it. So let's move on, let's give our panelists a big round of applause.